Hello, dear chess friends. I'm International Master Andrey Ostrovskiy, and you're welcome to the series of lessons dedicated to the logic of chess. So, in this lesson, we will discuss the main principles of chess. In the very beginning, in the opening stage, it is very important to follow the following principles. So, the quick development, the control over the center, and quick castling to make the king safe. So let's have a look what happens if one of the sides follows the principles and another one violates them. So e4, in this game, white decided to occupy the center with the pawn, very natural and logical move, and black reacted with the g6. In many cases, this leads to so-called perk, but well, after g6, black of course has a lot of different ways of developing the pieces and keeps the flexibility. It is of course not a mistake, so the principle says to control the center, not necessarily occupy the center. So g6 gives black a possibility to control the center with the help of pieces mainly. So bishop goes to g7. From there, the bishop will control central e5 and d4 squares. White plays d4, occupying the center with the other pawn and grabbing the space, also opening diagonals for the bishops. Bishop goes to g7, knight to c3, d6, and knight to f3. So at this moment, we have typical position that usually leads to normal perk after, let's say, knight to f6, in which case both sides castle quickly. For example, bishop c4, castles and castles. And in a future fight, of course, white has some edge, because white has a bit more space already, but black has a lot of different ways of undermining central pawns, so that black has a lot of different ways of fighting for central squares, finding better positions for his pieces, and so on. So that is just a normal middle game. But in this game that I'm showing to you, after knight f3, black decided to play knight d7. And that is already very dubious decision, because the knight occupies, first of all, not very good position. So your task in the opening stage is to develop your pieces, and development means occupying active position. So if you put the knight like here on the passive position, it doesn't mean that you actually develop the knight. So you just change the position from the initial one to this new one, but it is not necessarily a good activity. So here on d7, the knight remains passive because it is limited with white's pawn d4, and the bishop c8 no longer has a chance to be developed, for instance, and this bishop no longer controls important squares. So knight d7, definitely a bad decision. White continues developing the pieces, so bishop goes to c4, another developing move. White is ready to castle already. We can notice that white has the advantage in development, and black is actually in trouble because white creates a very nasty threat of taking on f7. Just to demonstrate this threat, let's make the move which changes nothing in a position. So after a6, white simply takes on f7, and appears that the position of the knight on d7 causes serious problems, because after king f7, knight jumps to g5, attacking the king, and at the same time aiming to occupy e6 square. So if king remains around this square, and the only possibility to do this is actually to play king to f6, then it is checkmated. So knight d5, or let's say queen to f3, also leads to a checkmate, and that's it, game over. It is only 8th move, but that's it. So after knight g5, king should go to e8 or f8. If king goes to f8, then knight e6 with fork, and the game is also over because white manages to win the queen. And if king goes to a8, then knight does actually the same, so it goes to e6, and the queen is trapped. So this shows actually the great importance of controlling carefully squares around the king at the very beginning of the game, in the opening stage, especially squares like f7 or f2. So these squares are of a high importance because usually if you're not careful enough, your opponent can sacrifice the piece there, and it leads to a quick attack. against your king or against other pieces if they are not coordinated well, just like in this example. So knight d7 actually damaged this coordination and caused the problems to the queen mainly. So after bishop c4, black has to do something with the f7. It was still possible to keep playing with the help of, let's say, e6 move, but it looks a bit ugly and not in the spirit of Perk. It was probably also possible to try knight f6, but after knight f6, white still can take on f7, and after king f7, knight g5, let's say king to g8, and knight e6. This forces the queen here, then knight takes on c7, then knight takes on a8, and white will have, for some moves, the extra exchange as a result, and 2 pawns, and also great initiative because of the advantage in development and great possibilities of opening up the position quite quickly, and this will help white to use the ugly position of the king here, which also makes the rook ugly. So they were still playable, but black decided to play c5, undermining the center. So typically it is a good idea, but not here because we are still in the opening stage and we simply have different priorities. So instead of developing the pieces, trying to castle and so on, black does absolutely different things that are just not in the style of this position. So after c5, as we can see, the idea of black is just to have the space for a queen. So bishop f7 is not clear because of king f7, knight g5, king e8, knight e6, and queen a5. So after knight takes g7, at first glance looks like white managed to win the pawn, but in fact after king f7, the knight is attacked and it has no squares to move, so probably it's possible to play knight h5, and after g takes h5, queen takes h5, white definitely has compensation, but white has only 2 pawns, so this compensation is not complete in the material sense, so probably this position is not that great. So instead, white decided to play knight g5. Also very nice move, and again, this underlines the problem that black has with the f7 pawn and f7 point in general. So f7 is under attack already twice, and black has serious problem because now, for instance, e6 leads to bishop takes e6. Another combination, again using the vulnerability of black's pawns and a very bad coordination that was caused by the knight d7 move. So it takes e6, knight takes e6, attacking the queen and the bishop. And now if queen goes to f6 or e7, the knight jumps to d5. So another knight joins the attack, and appears that it decides, because if queen takes e6, then knight c7, winning the queen and winning the game very soon. So queen has to go to a5, and after knight takes g7, king f7, and knight h5, we actually deal with the same maneuver like in the previous line, but the difference is that here black has no e-pawn, and this means white has already 3 pawns to compensate the minor piece, and it is usually just enough. So white definitely has the sufficient compensation in the material sense, and also white's position is much better because white managed to solve all opening problems. So white already castled, all the pieces are active, and white is ready just to crush black, attacking the king, opening up the position, and so on. So black is still in the opening stage here, having almost all pieces not developed. In the game, black decided to play knight to h6, extremely ugly position for the knight, but the main problem is that it doesn't really help, because after that bishop takes f7, this combination, because now king has no chance to take, so the knight has to take on f7, and knight jumps to e6. Very, very ugly position. So queen is attacked, queen went away, knight took on g7 with check, king went to f8, and knight came back to e6. And here actually black resigned. Well, you may think that it was premature because white won only 1 pawn, but in fact the problem is that another knight also coming to d5 with the decisive invasion to c7. So black has no normal defense here. So the king, for example, goes to e8, knight goes to d5, attacking the queen with the tempo. The next move will be knight d5 to c7. And if queen goes to a5 with check, then intermediate b4 move also attacking the queen decides. So the position is absolutely lost, which actually proves that if one of the sides violates the opening principles, the game may well be finished in the opening already quite quickly. So once again, three main goals in the opening stage. Control over the center, not necessarily occupation of the center with pawns. You just need the normal control, maybe with pieces, instead of pawns. Quick development and quick castling. When both sides play decent chess in the opening stage, of course, in the majority of cases, the game goes to the next stage, to the middle game. So let's have a look. e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, knight c3, knight f6. So-called four knights. Very old opening, very popular among newcomers, among beginners. So here, usually, according to this theory, white has only tiny chances to achieve the opening advantage. But anyway, it is a playable thing, and here, actually, it is very simple to find good squares for the pieces. It is very simple to complete the development in time, and so on. So it is highly recommended to try this opening if you want to improve your chess. So white decided to play d4, one of the typical moves here. White tries to grab a bit more space, because if black takes, then after knight takes d4, we can see that white has one more pawn in the center. So if compared to black, and this leads to the position with a bit more space for white usually, but it is absolutely playable position, and it is the main line to take on d4, so the next move can be bishop b4, also developing the piece, already being ready to castle and counter-attack in white's center. So it is absolutely normal position. So as a compensation for a missing pawn in the center, black has the open file. It is the e file, so usually rook after castling gets to e8 to counter-attack along this e file. In this game, black, however, decided to play bishop b4. It is a tricky move, a tricky line. There are a lot of traps, and of course white has to know this very well to play this, because now there is a threat of taking on e4. So it is a counter-attack of the center. As we can see, white played d4 to attack e5, central pawn. Black developed the piece on b4 to counter-attack e4. So very healthy approach, but white can take on e5 here. And now after knight takes e4, the move that regains the material, white has queen g4, which leads to enormous complications, because there is an attack against g7 and e4, and black can take now on c3, and so on. So there are a lot of different complicated variations. If you have the interest, you can investigate. But in our game, black decided to try queen e7. Usually there is a hint not to develop the queen early in the opening, because it may become the object of attack. Here, actually, queen e7 is a playable move, so the queen is probably not that easy target for white pieces. And again, it is a tricky move, because now, for instance, if white takes on c6, then queen takes e4, using the fact that knight c3 is pinned, it is check, and white has serious problems, so black has no problems at all after that. This leads to a very good position for black. If white protects the pawn with the bishop here, pawn e4, then knight takes d4, and again, the knight on e5 is hanging. If knight goes away, white will have problem with the e4 pawn, and so on. So queen e7 looks like an interesting alternative. And here white has to be very precise. So white decided to play queen d3 in this game. Very good decision, to be honest. So once again, there might be a problem with making such a decision, because there is a hint usually not to develop the queen early in the game. But here it looks like the most solid continuation, protecting everything in the center, preventing the worst, connected with capturing e4 and so on. And this literally forces black to take on e5 now. because white protecting e4 pawn already created a threat of taking on c6 and just continuing with the extra material. And after knight takes c5, d takes c5, and queen takes c5, we can see that white can opt for castling long here. After moving the queen to d3, of course, it is the logical idea. So to do this, bishop c1 goes to d2, just preparing the castling, and at the same time solving the main problem with the queen. In our game, black decided to make castling here, but let's have a look what happens if black takes the knight on c3. So in this case, after bishop takes c3, black has a choice between moving away the queen, but if queen simply goes away, it's not really clear why black exchanged the bishop for the knight in the early stage of the game. It is usually not a good idea because it gives the opponent so-called advantage of pair of bishops, and especially here when we deal with the more or less open position, and the position has the potential of being even more open. So it is definitely not a good idea. But what about capturing the pawn? So after that, queen takes queen, knight takes queen. We can see that the game already reaches the endgame stage. So every time when you exchange queens, you more or less deal with the endgame stage already. Especially here when some pieces were already exchanged, so we definitely don't have a lot of pieces on the board after this exchange, so it is definitely the endgame stage. And this endgame is better for white. So white takes on g7 here, immediately regaining the missing material, and after, let's say, rook to g8, the only move to save the rook, and bishop d4, we deal with the very promising endgame for white, and quite hard to play with black. At first glance, it looks like black is alright because, well, black has the good knight on e4, very active one, and it doesn't feel like black will have the problem with the completing the development of the bishop c8 and then castling and so on. In fact, this knight on e4 is not for a long time, for sure, because white will have a chance to kick this knight away at any moment with the help of f3. And actually, white has just much better pawns. So let's have a look on this position carefully. So black has pawns h7 and f7 that can't protect each other. So they are torn apart. There are typical weaknesses, and it is very easy for the side that has the pair of bishops to cause problems to this sort of pawns. So it is also not that hard in the future to maneuver the rook somehow through the third or fourth rank to attack those pawns. White has no pawn weaknesses at all. And for the endgame stage, it is already very, very important factor that helps us to understand who is better. Because if in the middle game stage or opening stage, well, the weakened pawn or something like that is of course a bad thing, but you have a chance to compensate this weakness with the active play somewhere. So in the endgame stage, you simply have less resources to create a counterplay, which means that every weakness counts. It is one of the most important principles of the endgame stage, to be honest. So do not create weaknesses if you are not forced to. And here, this complete operation of exchanging queens actually forced black to create this weakness. So actually white took on g7 and these weaknesses arose. That's a big problem. So a few lines just to understand the endgame stage better. For example, if black plays d6 here, then after bishop d3, normal development move, black already has the concrete problem with protecting h7 pawn. For example, if knight goes to c5, then bishop grabs h7, and after rook takes g2, well, the balance is still normal, but after h4, white's passed pawn goes to h8 square, almost automatically supported by the bishop and by the rook and another bishop as well. So another important principle in endgame stage, create passed pawns, and passed pawns are simply very, very important pawns. They are much more important than other types of pawns, and they may change the evaluation of the position. So here, having the passed pawn already, and especially this one, which is very dangerous and almost unstoppable, white has almost a decisive advantage. If after bishop d3 black decides to protect the knight with the pawn, this only weakens position more, and after castling, white has the advantage in development in addition to the advantages we already discussed, and black simply can experience the problem with the own king. So another thing, never forget that if there are still some pieces on the board, they may cause the problems to your king despite it is an endgame stage already. So be careful, because coordinated pieces, even a few coordinated pieces, can deliver a checkmate in attack. If black after bishop d4 tries d5 move, which is a bit more solid because it protects the knight, white can try the following: just f3, kicking the knight away from the center. Knight goes to d6, now castles. So this move helps white to deal with d5, so it is another object of attack. White can try to attack this pawn as well, and this simply brings the rook to the game quickly. So now there is a threat of rook e1 check, and if bishop f5, let's say, then white can start a great attack. After g4, bishop g6, h4. Another important principle of the endgame stage: you have to push pawns on the side where you are better. So here it is definitely the king side, because white has a pawn majority. So 3 pawns against 2 pawns, which means that white can gradually push in pawns just to create a passed pawn there. And at the same time, white just grabs the space, controls important squares, makes opponent's pieces less and less active. There is also a possibility to play h5, trapping the bishop already, so black has to deal somehow with that. If black plays h6, let's say, then white plays h5. Very important move, just attacking the bishop and fixing the pawn on h6, which is now not possible to protect. For instance, after bishop h7, white simply wins this pawn with the help of bishop e3 move. So, as I said before, these pawns on the king side are quite vulnerable, and if they start moving, they become even more vulnerable. That is the rule. So after h5, white can continue with a very good move, bishop f6, now attacking d5 pawn and also preventing black's king from castling long, so that's causing serious problems to this guy, because after c6, look, white can simply start the attack. Rook e1 check, king d7, rook e7 check, everything is forced. King goes to c8, g takes h5, bishop takes h5, now bishop to h3, check. King goes to b8, bishop e5. So move by move, white increases pressure and uses the fact that black's pieces are not coordinated. Rook goes to d8, bishop takes d6, rook takes d6. Now rook goes to e8 check, king goes to c7, and rook takes on a8. This again shows that actually even the group of a few pieces, but well-coordinated pieces, can deliver a serious and dangerous attack against the king, even in the endgame stage. Let's summarize the most important principles of the endgame stage. So, first of all, weaknesses are very important. So in the endgame stage, every single weakness has much more importance than in any other stage of the game, because, well, having less pieces, it is simply not that easy to compensate such a weakness. Another principle is the safety of the king. So the general rule says that in the endgame stage, of course, you have to centralize your king, because it is highly unlikely that you will be checkmated, so that the king can play the active role. But sometimes, and this endgame analysis shows that it is very important to evaluate opponent's resources, because even the few pieces can deliver a checkmate in attack, or at least very dangerous attack, so it should be also considered. Another interesting principle, very important one, is to play on the side where you are better. So in many cases, you have to push pawns on the side where you have a pawn majority, because in this case, you have a chance to create a passed pawn there. And another principle about the passed pawn again, the passed pawn is actually very important pawn, and the side that creates the passed pawn and has a chance to save this pawn and support it in its movement towards the promotion square usually has the serious advantage. So the one has to be very careful about passed pawns and actually has to try to create own passed pawns and to use them. Thanks a lot for your attention. In the next lesson, we will continue with the analysis of this game, and we will see what happened in the middle game stage.